Tilea's Troubles, Special Video 9. A First Edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle Reenactment. Episode 1. Background, Figures, Lists and Scenario. I feel like I should start with an apology, because this video has nothing to do with Tilea. It's set in a time when Tilea didn't even exist, all the way back through the eons in 1984. This was an experiment I'd wanted to do for a long time, a reenactment of my earliest Warhammer experiences, by which I mean using the first edition black and white rules and employing only figures and scenery that were available in 1984. In 2012, I finally got around to running the game, ably assisted by my wargaming mates Ant, Damien and Simon. Now, 13 years after that, I'm making the video. I tried to make the game as authentic as possible, yet some anachronisms still crept in. Then again, has there ever been a reenactment of anything without at least some anachronisms? The question is, will you spot them? I'll mention a few in the description, but not all of them. First, I should give you some background for the character I myself was playing. This was a relatively easy role-playing task, for the character was my own younger self. So, let's go back more than 4 decades. Weird wibbly-wobbly going back in time music. Prologue. It's autumn, 1984, and 16-year-old Eddie, that's what all his school friends call him, lives in this house. You can see his shadow. He thinks of himself as a games master. He even has the T-shirt. His younger brother's T-shirt, however, has Necromancer on it, for he was the proud owner of an army of what he called skellybobs. He'd scratched that name onto the little toolbox he carried them in. You'll see some of them later. Eddie had earned the right to wear this T-shirt. Oh yes, for he had been running traveller science fiction role-playing campaigns for several years in school, at weekends and in the holidays. He was obsessed. When not at school, the games were played in his garage with the local kids and a Calagas heater to keep everyone warm in the winter months. His players' PCs had been everywhere, doing it all, springing prisoners from high-tech asteroid facilities, hunting dangerous criminals in Starport Downs, avoiding policing droids, hiding in hab units, landing on low-tech worlds to show off their almost magical powers, and scrabbling for the last handful of bullets in Mad Max-type post-apocalyptic wastelands, and much more. Earlier in the 80s, he had somehow turned Traveller's combat rules into wargame rules, so that he could fight 1/32nd scale Napoleonic battles with air-fixed soldiers in his garden, invading the neighbours' gardens as more kids from the street joined in. Mind you, even when on beach holidays with no rule books or toy soldiers, he still found ways to fight imaginary battles. Soon, all their toy soldier battles turned into proper rules and dice war games. From World War II battles, using hundreds of Airfix and Britain soldiers, bad guys and good guys galore, to high-tech commandos attacking James Bond villains' private armies, and even far future heroes and villains. He could have used the 1/72nd scale figures, that's 20mm, getting more little fellas for less and not needing anything like the space. But the bigger guys, 1/32nd scale, i.e. 54mm, just seemed more substantial, more real, and he had his collections from years before. Still, he did build and paint on the smaller scale too. He'd been using 15mm figures for his traveller scenarios, and the 20mm Airfix vehicles fit in just fine with those figures. It was a memorable day indeed, when the local paper shop allowed him into the stockroom to choose loads of Airfix kits they were wanting rid of to free up the space, selling them for much reduced prices. It didn't occur to Eddie at the time that he was, in effect, entering Airfix heaven just as the hobby was diminishing. Before long, however, his new craze was turning the Airfix tank and plane kits into grav tanks and starfighters, inventing a rule system he called simply sci-fi. Every other boy in the street got involved, and he became the envy of all of them with his flying polystyrene packaging Death Star, stuffed with hardware and troops for assault landings in anyone's garden. This all went pear-shaped, however, as soon as nukes were incorporated into the games, so that entire garden empires could be reduced to ash in a mere moment. All a boy really needed was a missile, and what they called silos, in other words deodorant lids painted in camouflage colours and hidden in a flower bed, and the result was, boom, I win. If just one missile invaded the anti-missile missiles, then a whole garden could be turned to ash. The boys quickly learned never to model a missile without adding a smaller defensive missile onto its back, called anti-anti-missile missiles. But then they started using anti-anti-anti-missile missiles to accompany the anti-missile. And if 4 wasn't enough, then they would launch dozens. Every vehicle had to have missiles added to it, until eventually the modelling and painting of any other sort of hardware, apart from missiles, missile launchers, and a variety of anti-anti, etc., missiles, was pointless. In the end, Eddie and his mates had to ban all nuclear weapons, just so the garden wars could last more than a few minutes. There was one form of traveller-derived wargame that is particularly relevant here. What Eddie and his mates called medieval. As in, fancy a game of medieval? Knights, archers, catapults, etc. No nuclear missiles. Eddie once spent several days secretly preparing a lollipop stick siege tower while his neighbour's dad secretly made a castle. It was an anxious time indeed, with Eddie nervously worrying about whether or not his siege tower would be tall enough to reach the neighbours' as yet unseen parapets. Thankfully, it did, just, and a massive siege game taking a full afternoon ensued. All that work for one afternoon. I can't even remember now if I won. The figures were all 54mm, and Eddie's armies included Britain's knights. Britons had been around since 1847, but Eddie had been given these little fellas in the mid to late 1970s. And fake Timpo-style knights, sometimes called swap-its, because you could unplug their limbs and heads and swap them around. Timpo had been producing plastic figures from 1954 until they ceased operations in 78, but the ones Eddie had were, I think, made by some sort of copycat manufacturer. There were a few around, and Eddie had had these since he was very young. He'd repainted them to his taste and replaced their swords with plastic rods for lancers, held in place with a little twist of toilet roll. He was a resourceful child. These were allied with a large force of Airfix 1/32 scale men-at-arms, bought in 79, from longbowmen to halberders, axemen, swordsmen and morning star wielders. Eddie didn't know it at the time, but these games of medieval were to be an apprenticeship for an exciting fancy battle game that was just about to be published and which would invade his world big time. That day came in 1983, when he bought a new fantasy war game called Warhammer, the Mass Combat Fantasy Role-Playing Game. It was perfect, and it promised a whole new way to game. Very soon he was buying or moulding and painting 25mm lead figures by the score. He was drawing maps of worlds, regions, cities and wards, and running homemade role-playing scenarios by the dozen. He'd read often of a game called Dungeons & Dragons, but no one he knew played it, and so, encouraged by the fact that this game said it was a role-playing game, he took it at its word and began a role-playing campaign. There was no official game world, just combat rules, generic races and magic spells, etc. So, he had to make up his own realms to adventure in. For example, he devised his own pantheon of gods. Now, if I'm reading this correctly, apparently the mother, being life, begat Udap, the One, who begat the 4 great gods, Parawa, Ophawa, Juff and Hedron, and in the process some bits fell off to cause chaos. Also, and until I found these papers in the attic I had no idea, the world Eddie made was called Githarm. More prosaically, he typed up his own price lists, for that was another thing the rules didn't provide for. Here you can see how, as an afterthought, he penned on the weight of various items, but for many things he ruled the weight only counted against you if you were carrying them rather than wearing them. He lived, of necessity, in house rule heaven. There were several other scraps of paper from 1983 in the rules box, including this PC sheet belonging to Eddie's 15-year-old friend Jez. It's good to see Jez's character, Stanley Sauerkraut, had a public piety stat of 4 and that he was a citizen. On the rear of the little sheet you can see his experience points going up and his money going both up and down. Stanley obviously didn't care about the pennies, only the gold crowns. Unusually, presumably because of his strength stat of 2, It bears the motto, "Cool dude, brackets, weakling, he has the power to pick up a flower." Eddie's fantasy world grew and grew, with maps and maps within maps, above and below ground. Soon, as well as the adventuring quests by PC parties, there were battles that needed fighting. And before long, fighting army against army would be as frequent as creeping through caverns and dungeons. Preparing for battle. November 1984. This was to be one of Eddie's first battles using the new supplement to the Warhammer rules, Forces of Fantasy. He'd already role-played and wargamed a heck of a lot with the basic rules, but this supplement was to bring much more to the game. It corrected some rules, modified others, and added a bunch of new troop types and battalions. Eddie was now putting together a battle scenario for 4 of his school friends. He was going to provide the armies, the scenery, the story or scenario, as well as referee the game. Like many Warhammer players at the time, Eddie and his mates nearly always wargamed with a games master, aka referee, just like when they role-played. Unlike today's wargamers, every figure on the field was painted in enamels. This is not one of the Anacronisms, by the way. Every figure seen in this video is indeed painted with enamels, being the actual figures I had back then. And of course, every figure in the reenactment battle is made of lead. As for these particular paint pots, I freely admit they don't hail from the 1980s. The scenery. Having just converted and repainted an old plastic toy tower from the corner of a castle he'd had from early childhood, King Arthur's Castle by Gene Hoffler, B.I.G., from the early 1970s, he decided the scenario would involve an evil, necromantic wizard. The tower was to be the wizard's home, but Eddie wanted a little settlement for the servants, so he needed more scenery. First, there was his snap-together Airfix Le Hay Sant 1/72nd scale farmhouse model, produced from 1974 to 1980, which seemed perfect. To add a few more buildings, as one farmhouse and a yard didn't seem enough, he took out his first plaster-moulded Linker buildings. Linker had been around from 1979 onwards. These were very delicate things. The thin plaster made a little stronger by gluing cardboard behind the segmented wall sections. They were very satisfying hobby projects. Eddie had himself mixed and poured the plaster and water into the rubber moulds, letting them dry, and then very much enjoyed the act of carefully popping them out. It really felt like he was building something. There was another piece of scenery he was wondering about, but he couldn't decide if he wanted to use it. His 1/72nd scale Airfix Roman fort, which had been around since 1969. He'd already added extra depth to the battlements so that his 25mm square base figures could stand there. But as it would add a siege element to the game, an extra complication, he wasn't sure about it. He'd make the decision whether to use it or not later. He also had some stepped hills which he would use, and some clumps of trees made mostly from a cut-up plastic Christmas tree. Battalions. Now, Eddie had to write up the battalion lists. He began with the bad guys, deciding that 2 battalions of approximately 1,000 points would be sufficient. First up was the Necromancer and his Undead Battalion. Eddie decided that a full-on Necromancer of Mastery 3 or 4 cost way too many points. In the Book of Battalions, a black and white, non-glossy and very soft-covered supplement for Forces of Fantasy, with example armies in, there was an army of 3 battalions called the Conjurations of the Insane Necromancer Colin. The first battalion, 1,000 points in value, consisted solely of Colin. Eddie would instead have a mere acolyte as the tower's inhabitant and army commander. This type was only Mastery Level 2, but would still hopefully roll a sufficient number of spells to make up for the still quite large points cost. Wizards got to choose their spells, but not how many they had. Eddie wasn't sure how to generate the other characteristics for the acolyte, like leadership and willpower, etc., because the character generation rules didn't list Necromancer as an option. So he decided he would just make them up, using the character creation rules as a guideline. After all, he was a games master from the realm of house rules. The printed example, Colin the Insane Necromancer, had a full set of stats: intelligence, cool, willpower and leadership, which were all quite high in value, and which Eddie thought were unlikely to have been the result of random die rolls. He also noticed that every other battalion section told the player how to generate a leadership factor for the leader of every regiment, There was always a leader by default, even if not a champion. But the undead battalion rules did not mention this. Maybe that was because all undead regiments needed a champion, a character to lead them. In which case, then he would have to create characteristics for them too. He would worry about this later. To represent his Necromancer, Master Hobble, Eddie used a Citadel Miniatures evil elf sorceress. She'd do, even if she was playing the part of a human male. Eddie thought she, now he, looked about right. The figure was one he'd painted a good while before, evident from the fact he'd not begun his more exaggerated cartoon style of block painting, leaving black lining everywhere, even on faces. The rest of the evil army was to be a mixture of Citadel Miniatures, Essex Miniatures and Prince August moulded figures. Here you can see the skeleton riders, being Essex Miniatures figures from the 1980s onwards. These were just about Eddie's favourite figures. He loved how they had painted up, and had used them to cause considerable mayhem as NPCs in role-playing scenarios. He was looking forward to seeing how they'd do in battle. His main skeleton regiment was to be 30 strong, 10 more than the maximum of 20 recommended for undead in the Forces of Fantasy booklet, Fighting Fantasy Battles. But hey, it was his fantasy world, and imagination topped rules. This regiment was to consist of the newest figures he had, the latest Citadel Miniature skeletons, which he had painted up after buying them a month before. His champions would contain a few of these new figures too, as well as a fine mounted undead champion, also from Citadel. The rest of his force would be made up of Citadel skeleton archers, with a smattering of what I think are grenadier miniatures, apparently including the resurrected corpse of a crossbow-armed, horn-headed beastman. Then a 20-strong regiment of Prince August moulded figures, which were produced in Ireland from 1976 onwards. These he and his brother had forged themselves, using lead ingots melted on the cooker in the kitchen and carefully poured into the rubber moulds. His mum turned out to be not too happy with this alchemical procedure, and so his later figures were to be made using a little caligas stove in the back garden. Turns out Eddie was in safe hands, as his brother became a fireman in adult life. By the way, there is 45-year-old talcum powder still clinging to these moulds. These ones had turned out okay, he thought. He had more Prince August skeletons in his collection, seen here along with some 25mm scale basket and torch bearers from minifigs, from their 1978 Valley of the Four Winds line, which apparently Games Workshop had made a game for in 1980, and another couple of old Citadel miniatures. But he thought he'd better save these in case the Necromancer successfully managed to raise some during the battle. He might thus need more figures for that sort of magical malarkey. The second evil battalion would be Red Goblins, which according to the fluff were the kind bred by wizards to do their bidding and to serve as their soldiers. Just right for this scenario. He ignored the fact that his Red Goblins would be green. The leadership factors would be filled in before the game, all by rolling D3s. Once again, there were a variety of figures in this battalion, although two particular sets of three-figure Prince August Orc warrior moulds and their Orc Wolf Riders would provide the bulk of the goblins. More exciting, 2 Regiments of Renown, a feature of the Forces of Fantasy supplement, would supply some elite troops for the force, or in the case of goblins, elite-ish. 2 regiments of 30 Prince August warriors each had standard bearers of a make Eddie wasn't sure about. He'd got them second-hand from a convention stall. First, the plate-armoured regiment, which Eddie really liked the look of, especially as he had gone from his old style of painting to the new black lining one halfway through painting them. And then the Red Chicken Boys. He loved their fighting banner. The chicken was taken from the shield of a 54mm soldier. The standard bearer and the drummer were in fact old Ral Partha miniatures, being Tom Meyer goblins, around from 1979 onwards. The original standard must have fallen off, thus the chicken. These would be supported by a smaller 20 goblin spear regiment. These were Eddie's favourite of his Prince August orc moulds, which he had ruined by misapplying varnish and causing them all to frost up. He never knew what he'd done wrong, but he stopped varnishing figures after the incident. It turned out varnish was entirely unnecessary on enamel-painted figures, if only he'd known. Each warrior sported an ugly face design on his shield. The Wolf Riders were funny-looking dudes, with scrawny wolves, but they made the Essex Goblin hero look much better in comparison, so at least he would stand out. The Regiments of Renown, first advertised in 1984, were all Citadel miniatures. The models looked exactly like the illustrations in the Forces of Fantasy book. First, there was Grom's Goblin Guard, which for some reason didn't have their standard bearer. I still don't. In fact, until researching for this video, I didn't know there had ever been one. And second, Golgfag's Ogres, fine and fearsome foes for any fantasy fight. These were the resculpted second versions, apparently known as Goldfag's other ogre mercenaries. Now for the good guys. Eddie had to put together a force to fight the Necromancer's evil army. Once again, he created it out of the stuff he'd been painting over the last year, but this time there would be very few Citadel miniatures figures in the army. Note, this deficiency is not due to Reenactment not having some more of the old Citadel figures, but because I wanted to use only the figures I actually possessed in 1984. I don't think, back then, the notion that one ought to play Warhammer battles with only Citadel miniatures had occurred to anyone. To balance the evil army, this army needed 2 battalions, which would be the Kings and the Barons. Eddie would come up with the names, personalities and background when he wrote up the scenario. For now, he simply needed about 2,000 points of Men of the West. The first would be the Petty King's own force, including his handful of noble knights, his royal men-at-arms, and a large contingent of his labouring subjects, carrying the longbows Eddie decided they were required by law to practice with from youth. The king was to have a wizardly advisor with him. Let's face it, you'd want someone like this helping out when facing an evil mage and his magical army. Don't ask me why wizards cost exponentially more in points compared to heroes. They just did. Eddie simply assumed it had to be that way. His Majesty rode upon the best destrier in his little realm, alongside his nobles, as was right and proper. These are Essex Miniatures Knights from the 1980s, and a mid-1980s Citadel-mounted wizard, clearly representing Gandalf on Shadowfax, although here the famous Maras is painted black. I admit, this figure is actually from 1985, when Citadel took over the licence from Grenadier, so its inclusion is a historical anachronism. I did say earlier that there had to be a few, otherwise this wouldn't feel like a real reenactment. But then again, and as this is a fantasy reenactment, I think this is forgivable. I could claim that Eddie had got caught up in a little bit of time-bending magic, just like his 1980s fictional contemporary Donnie Darko, and had thus somehow come into possession of a figure from 6 months in the future. The King's Longbowmen were both numerous and colourful. My memory has failed me regarding who made these guys. I did a web search to ID these figures and turned up an image of them, but alas, the caption simply said, "No idea of the manufacturer." I know I definitely had them in the 1980s, but did I have them in 1984? All I can say is, I think so. Next up, a little regiment of the Royal Household's men-at-arms. These are Essex miniatures. Apart from the heavily armoured fellow on the right, he's Citadel, from the 1983 Warrior Knights of Law Speciality Set 5A. Eddie had the whole set, painted up, which he'd been using in his role-playing adventures, but apart from the one already mentioned, the rest wouldn't feature in this particular battle. The last regiment in the Kings Battalion were a bunch of somewhat more rustic spearmen, the men of his petty kingdom's watch, who, when soldiering, acted as forest and road wardens, gamekeepers, etc. These figures were another band that Eddie had made from Prince August moulds, although he had messed about with their shields, converting some a little to add a smattering of individuality. Milliput was something Eddie found very useful. The Barons Battalion represented the soldiers of the king's most powerful vassal, his cousin, who governed the Marcher regions and wilder portions of the king's realm. His force was drawn from those lands, and as such was a little more primitive than the king's, although the men were perhaps proportionately more rugged as a consequence. The force consisted almost entirely of spearmen, either on foot or mounted, apart from a band of serf archers. The Baron was mounted, like his best warriors, on a sturdy little horse, but unlike them he sported rather more fancy armour. These are all warrior miniatures, made in Glasgow from 1973 onwards, But although the Baron in the centre is the same figure as the fellow to the left of him on the brown horse, Eddie had once again used milliput to make an otherwise historical Norman look considerably more fantasy. He'd been doing quite a lot of milliput conversions, altering a number of his warrior miniatures Normans to make them look more individual, better suited to the role-playing scenarios. Although these figures don't feature in the army for this battle, here are 3 examples. Each picture shows multiples of the same figure, but converted in different ways. He had 2 batches of these, the first 10 being an attempt to make them look more like barbarians, and the second 10 in black, riding black horses, being loosely inspired by the opening scenes of Conan the Destroyer, which had come out that October. Anyway, back to the battalion. The real backbone, the bulk of the Baron's force, was to be 3 regiments of masked spearmen, 80 altogether, 60 armoured men-at-arms and 20 lesser warriors without chainmail. Once again, these are warrior miniatures Normans. Finally, the serfs, carrying bows and somewhat less flamboyantly attired than the rest of the army, being in undyed linen and wool. Weirdly white and bright, but that's Fantasy Worlds for you. These are warriors miniatures too. Planning the scenario. Eddie was to set this battle in his own created world, and decided whatever happened would become background history for the lands around a city named Coverhesh. The current ruler in his role-playing campaign was King Rathard II, and Eddie decided this would be a historical battle from the time of Rathard II's great-grandfather of the same name, King Rathard I, the petty king described in the above army lists. Coverhesh sat upon the Lonir River, just north of the Great Tumul Forest and west of the plain of Lisbal. Baron Claren, commander of the 2nd Battalion, was the ruler of the eastern parts of this plain, his fiefdom stretching northwards from the plains to the foothills of the Birals Mountains, an area known as Mansu, and south and east as far as the Uthral River, including the western mounds of the Green Odoth Hills. This map is, like the figures, also from 1984. I have too much stuff, especially when you consider I haven't used this map or the Ringbinder file it was part of since 1985. In 1986 or thereabouts, memory hazy here, I magically turned this region and its neighbours into a part of the Border Princes, which was a lucky match in terms of the general shape and nature. That was my means of entry into the official Warhammer world. The kind of lands the map showed suited the sort of regiments the king and the baron commanded. The baron's riders were from the plains, his footmen from the settlements in the hills. The king's handful of knights ruled fiefs closer to the city and had brought some of their vassals, while the smaller regiments of men-at-arms and longbowmen were from the city itself. The good characters. King Rathard, a hero. Using the player character rules from the basic rules, Eddie rolled the king's characteristics. The stats seemed to indicate a quiet, scholarly type, who was sometimes brave enough to bear hardships, but more like a martyr, and not in the heroic way that inspires soldiers to follow. His leadership of 2 was insufficient to allow his stats to add any modifiers to fear, terror or morale rolls. The lack of willpower indicated little in the way of determination, however, so he was probably the sort of man who changes his mind a lot and left things incomplete. Yet he did have the basic stats of a hero, so he must have been young, fit, and probably from a family of warriors. His title alone, being a king, meant he will have a +2 to morale tests of the unit he is leading. Here you can see King Rathard outside one of the city gatehouses, attired for war in the latest fashion of armour, wearing the yellow and blue colours of his house. This gate is guarded by men-at-arms who serve the king's knight, seen here on the king's left. The Baron, a mighty hero. His leadership factor of 3 would have an effect, but such a low intelligence meant that if he were a PC in the role-playing version of the game, he could not learn more than 1 skill. This guy was pretty thick. His other scores were average, so one can only assume his men were inspired by him due to his mighty hero physical attributes and his fighting prowess on the field of battle. Here you can see the brutish Baron Claren riding out on a hunt at the head of his retainers. Eddie liked these characters and didn't feel the need to nudge the role's results, a GM's prerogative, he believed. A weak-willed but young and clever king made him think of his O-level English lit Shakespeare studies and King Richard II, whereas Baron Claren just sounded like a thug. And why not? The bad guy. The troublesome minor necromancer, one Master Hobble, had occupied and repaired, as well as his goblins could, the ruined Tower of Bal in the eastern reaches of Green Odoth. This used to be the home of a wizard who was lord of the relatively treeless valley between Bendor Forest and the hills. Eddie had already decided he wanted this necromancer to rely on something other than his own necromantic skills, which, as he was only an acolyte, were limited, to give him command of such a force. Perhaps it is something to do with the tower, which is the reason the necromancer occupied it. An idea was forming in Eddie's mind. Before I reveal it, we'd better take a look at the necromancer. Master Hobble was an acolyte necromancer. Some stats were derived from the entry in the Forces of Fantasy supplement. Others were derived from the basic rules, characters and magic book, with a bit of GM interpretation needed where things were not clear, like how a wizard's constitution was his willpower plus 2d6, but was also 2d4 times his mastery level plus 4, but was also listed simply as 12. In truth, these weren't exactly contradictory. The first referred to starting player characters, the second to random NPC generation, the third to the undead acolyte entry for the battalion. But they did mean Eddie had to think a bit about what he was doing. Hobble got lucky with the rolls, even getting a level 2 necromancy spell. Eddie decided he could let them all stand. A player, or GM, could simply choose the spells from the list, but the necromantic lists were short, 3 level 1 and 2 level 2. Eddie picked Hold Undead simply because it suited the story. It was the spell Hobble would learn before even approaching the Tower of Bal. From the stats, Hobble seemed to be a very cunning sort of fellow, with maximum intelligence for a human, and had the maximum number of necromancy spells available to him at both levels, so he must have done well in his studies of the evil art. Now, back to Eddie's idea. He wanted the scenario to revolve around defeating Hobble, obviously, but also to incorporate the location as part of the victory mechanics, thus making it more than a simple army versus army battle, and to explain why Hobble had occupied a tower dangerously within reach of his natural enemies. The Tower of Bal. This ancient, yet unexceptional tower was once occupied by a wizard of great repute. By the way, I've just noticed how the tower mysteriously casts a shadow on the night sky itself. Now that's what I call arcane power. That wizard spent his entire life studying the art of alchemy and, secretly, the art of necromancy, yearning to find not just an elixir of life, but a potion that could reinvigorate the dead, not to make them undead, but returning them to actual life. Finally, he fashioned a chemical compound which solidified into a solid lump of visibly energetic matter. When he channeled magical power into it, however, all hell broke loose. The scattered corpses he had been using for years in his experiments, discarded and left to rot throughout the tower until some of them were almost entirely skeletal, all burst into unlife, each and every one filled with hatred for the necromancer who had imprisoned, starved, tortured, killed, then horribly reinvigorated them with incantations. Infused with tremendous energy, they attacked him and tore him to pieces. After this, the valley became a hellish place of nightmares, depleted of all living things by the nightly bands of meandering undead that issued from the tower. As the years went by, the power of the necromantic stone diminished, until only ghosts inhabited the shadows of night, and life could return to the valley. Master Hobble learned of the place, sifting through garbled myth and legend to ascertain the truth concerning its location and past. He came to the tower to see if he could make use of the stone himself to boost the power of his own necromantic conjurations and spells. His approach to experimentation was rather more cautious than the ancient necromancer, helped by the fact that he was still mostly sane. Slowly, carefully, he repowered the stone. After several quiet months, during which his growing band of red goblin and ogre mercenaries guarded the valley from unwanted incursions or curious travellers, he has finally learned how to allow the stone's energies to flow in a controlled manner, allowing him to retain full mastery of the undead he had invigorated. Then, just as he was congratulating himself and racking his brains to recall what it was he wanted to do when he had control of an undead army, he'd carelessly forgotten along the way, he learned from his mercenary goblin scouts that an armed force was approaching from the west. The battle scenario. King Rathard's wizardly advisor knew about the history of the Tower of Bal and had, correctly, assumed that something remained there that was empowering the Necromancer's incantations. He informed the king that if he could get inside the tower, he could then destroy the source of the Necromancer's power. For this, the wizard prepared an alchemical mixture to pour upon the stone which would shatter it. Victory would thus be determined by whether or not the stone was destroyed. If it was destroyed, the undead would have to start taking 2 instability tests per turn instead of 1, or, if it is night, 1 test per turn instead of none. The wizard would need to cast Detect Object successfully once inside the tower, then spend a turn getting to it and destroying it. He told the king and the baron about the stone and his mixture, so that if he was to be incapacitated, the king or the baron could try to do what he intended. Although if they did try, they have only a 4, 5 or 6 chance of succeeding, considering they didn't have his magical sense or knowledge, and they didn't possess the Detect Object spell. The king's forces were to attack in daylight, as the undead were not subject to instability at night. This was a crucial part of their plan. Normally, a GM must roll 2d6 to determine how many turns of the battle are fought before twilight, a 2 to 12 spread with an average of 7. But considering that the king's forces are deliberately trying to attack early in the day, Eddie decided to increase the minimum and average number of turns by rolling 4d3 instead, thus a 4 to 12 spread with an average of 10. Twilight would last 2 turns, after which darkness proper would fall. Finally, Eddie needed to prepare the good wizard for the scenario, to roll up stats and choose spells, the sort of spells a wizard would study before setting out on this sort of quest, and Detect Object was one of them. Yes, thought Eddie, that would do. I hope you're enjoying the account so far. The next special video will be the battle report itself.